This used to be the Frankfurt PX. For many Americans, it's now just a memory. But what isn't forgotten is the memory of a terrorist attack that occurred here in 1985.
Ed Pimental was an average man, but to his family he meant the world. He just arrived to his much-hoped-for assignment in Wiesbaden along the Rhine. It's a beautiful city, and at that bright young age of 20, he was just a low-ranking army specialist attached to the 563rd Ordnance Company, based out of Camp Peary. To a young man from Fall River, Massachusetts, this must have been the most exciting moment of his life. Soldiers called Peary the Hill because it overlooks the old river town, and it must have seemed exotic to young GIs who couldn't help but see the ruins of the Third Reich that their fathers and grandfathers had helped to crush. Entering the gates of the old camp, visitors are confronted with a Reichsadler, the remains of the not-too-distant past. There's something symbolic about these barracks, built on farmland in 1937. The Nazis remilitarized after the occupation of the Rhine had ended and used the new lager as a transmitter and communications hub. After the war, the camp remained in use by the U.S. military until the 1990s when it became private apartments. But back to young Pimental. There aren't many photos of him online, but this was posted by a relative showing Ed at age 7 back in the United States. On the night of August 7th, he got together with a few friends at the barracks and carpooled to 19 Dotzheimer Street in the old part of Wiesbaden. They were looking for some German girls to chat with, as you do in the military. At the time, the building hosted the Western Saloon, catering U.S. soldiers and locals who loved them. One young woman walked up and started flirting with the Americans, forcing a smile and giving a fake name. This was Birgit Hochfield, a fanatical left-wing terrorist. Over the next 48 hours, Pimental was murdered, a car bomb killed 2 more people at a nearby airfield, and the Red Army faction lost what little influence it still had from the heights of the Cold War. The murder was the final straw for many leftist insurgent groups that used to elevate the RAF in solidarity, an action that was considered so cowardly it essentially ended the Red Army faction. Darkness set in and Birgit Hochfield asked if Pimental could walk her home. The soldier waved goodbye to his friends at the bar and walked outside. It's difficult to find sources in English on what precisely happened, but he was killed sometime between the 7th and the 8th. There was never a plan to hold him as a hostage, to rob him, or even propagandize his killing. In truth, the new RAF just wanted to find a GI that looked similar to one of the group's members. Pimental was killed, and the RAF used his military ID to gain access to the nearby Rhine-Main Air Base near Frankfurt, and a bomb was placed at the officers' club. The planting of the bomb was sometime around 7 a.m. on the morning of the 8th.
In West Germany, a car bomb exploded at a U.S. Army post in Frankfurt. 36 were injured there, most of them Americans.
There wasn't much thought put into the hiding of the specialist's body, so he was found in the nearby forest that same morning, shot in the head. The attack, already impossible to use for leftist propaganda, somehow got worse. Apparently, they had tried targeting the officers' club, but the 240-kilogram bomb was placed between the club and the base shop. Left-wing terror groups historically rely on striking high-profile targets to gain public sympathy. Preparing the attack killed a specialist fresh out of basic training, and the subsequent car bomb hit a military spouse, a young woman from Texas named Becky Jo Bristol, and a low-ranking A1C from Michigan named Frank Scarton. They got 2 very low-ranking enlisted people and a wife. The Wiesbaden cell went into hiding immediately, avoiding even other left-wing groups in fear of reprisals. It can't be said that they didn't try to make propaganda of the situation, however. When they mailed Pimental's ID to the local press office, they issued a statement jointly signed by the French group Action Direct, claiming that he was a, quote, contract warmonger. The RAF, entrusted to carry out the bombing, hoped to destroy the headquarters or hit an officer's party. They failed horribly in this task. This was mostly the end of the third-generation RAF. Commanding the group was Eva Hall, who convinced Birgit Hochfield to lure Pimental into a trap where he was killed. Wolfgang Grams was Hochfield's boyfriend and was arguably looped into militancy through bad upbringing and his girlfriend's obsession with becoming an urban guerrilla.
Bitte das Bundeskriminalamt ihre Mitarbeit. Gesucht werden Wolfgang Werner Grams und Birgit Elisabeth Hogefeld. Sie sind dringend verdächtig, sich dem harten Kern der Rote Armee-Fraktion angeschlossen zu haben. Grams ist 33 Jahre alt, 1,80 Meter groß und spricht hessischen Dialekt. Er hat blaugraue Augen und eine dunkle Hautveränderung neben der Nase. Beide könnten ihr Erscheinungsbild inzwischen verändert haben, wie das Bundeskriminalamt mit Hilfe der Filtermontagen zu verdeutlichen versucht.
He was only more committed to the cause after the 1985 killings. He became one of the most wanted men in Germany and couldn't expect a normal life from that point forward. These terrorists have a fascinating dynamic, mostly due to Wolfgang's reluctant nature. His backstory deserves a movie, and I think shows a great example of how an average man can get dragged into such a sad and radicalized situation. To understand Wolfgang Grams, you need to understand why the RAF was formed to begin with. Throughout the 50s and 60s, young West Germans grew increasingly frustrated at a perceived lack of remorse over the actions of the older generation. Many men who had crucial roles in the Nazi state now found themselves working for West Germany. Just take this as an example. Each country on this map, marked with a swastika, represents a country whose ambassador from West Germany was a member of the Nazi Party during World War II. Academics, judges, and lawyers were often high-ranking Nazi Party officials, and few of them properly denounced their roles after the Second World War, at least according to these student activists. Wolfgang Grams' father was an ideologically committed Nazi. He joined the Waffen-SS, and Wolfgang recognized the same language from modern conservatives in West Germany that he'd heard from his father. They needed to oppose the godlessness of Bolshevism to the east, a militaristic approach to isolating and destroying the spread of communism, and a rapid expansion of NATO's influence throughout Western Europe. Around the mid-60s, most members who would go on to be founders of the RAF were either already committed Marxist-Leninists or fence-sitting anarcho-socialists. Wolfgang was in the latter camp, moving from squats to tent camps, couch-surfing with increasingly radical friends. Grams is, in many ways, a perfect picture of what motivated young people to join the RAF at this time. He was raised by a Nazi and grew up in Wiesbaden, surrounded by U.S. troops at the height of the Vietnam War. When the original RAF was gaining traction, Grams was on the sidelines. Thanks to his Nazi father and his proximity to U.S. troops in Wiesbaden and in Berlin, where he was squatting, he became radicalized. For many people, it happened in this way. Rudi Dutschke was a figure that helped unite the far left and moderate centrist left in West Germany. He'd opposed East Germany's forced military service and became a conscientious objector and eventually a refugee to West Germany on religious grounds. Politically, he was a left-leaning Christian socialist, very thoughtful yet reluctant that history had thrust him into the role of figurehead for the country's anti-war student movement, which was boiling over since the beginning of the Vietnam War.
Revolution ist nicht eine Sache von Tagen, wo geschossen wird und Auseinandersetzung stattfindet. Revolution ist ein lang andauernder Marsch und Prozess um die Schaffung von neuen Menschen, die fähig sind, nicht eine Clique durch eine andere zu ersetzen nach der Revolution, sondern massenhaft Demokratisierung von unten, bewusste Produzentendemokratie entgegenzusetzen, bürokratische Herrschaft von oben. An diesem Kampf habt ihr weiterzuarbeiten.
In early June 1967, Berlin students affiliated with Rudi Dutschke's student movement were protesting a visit from the Shah of Iran. 26-year-old Benno Ohrensorg, who studied Romance and German history at the Free University of Berlin, attended the event and on horseback began beating their heads with metal batons. Chaos ensued. Benno Ohrensorg ran into the courtyard at Krummstrasse 66, where several West German police were seen to corner him. Witnesses saw a savage beating, followed by Officer Karl-Heinz behind a pregnant wife. At trial, it was found that Officer Kurris's crimes had been covered up by his buddies in the police. Attempts were made to hide the gunshot wound. It was also revealed that most of the pro-Shah protesters had been liberation movements and Christian pacifists and resistance fighters, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer of the Confessing Church or Karl Barth, who, in spite of being Protestant, was called the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas by Pope Pius XII. Seeing a student executed by Berlin police and covered up by the German government unnerved him. He'd formed the Socialist German Students Association, and after the death of Benno Ohrensorg, tried to step back from that organization. Like many great revolutionaries, Rudi Dutschke believed that the revolution should be led by the people and ought not to have a figurehead. The socialist students and their political body, the APO, or the Extra-Parliamentary Opposition, were essentially leaderless as Rudi and his wife announced plans to travel to America and study Latin American revolutionary movements for a year or two. They remained active in politics locally, but it was obvious that they were trying to take a step back, where he engaged police in a firefight and naively thought that these cops would be on his side. He survived the shootout, as did Rudi Dutschke, miraculously. Sadly, both men would later die, Rudi of his wounds years later after a struggle to relearn how to speak, and Josef by his own hand. He was found hanging in a prison cell. Meanwhile, the Socialist German Students' Association disbanded in response to the attempted killing. Liberals and anarchists tended to drift back to their classes, jobs, and squats, but radicals gravitated towards Heidelberg, where a more revolutionary cell of students refused to break up. They took a new name, and even at this early stage began to accept a large crossover from members of the SPK, the Socialist Patients Collective. Members of this group were mostly in and out of psychiatric institutions and argued that being mentally unwell was the only logical response to an ill society. Their motto was literally, "Turn illness into a weapon." Here in Heidelberg, the SPK and the rogue Socialist Students Association chapter merged into what would become the Red Army faction. If we're analyzing the rise of the RAF through the lens of Wolfgang Grams, it's important to remember that he's probably going to anti-war protests and hanging out with anarchists while all of these events happen. One of the early members of the SPK, the Socialist Patients Collective, and a founding member of the Red Army faction was Petra Schelm, a beautiful hairdresser who'd grown up in West Berlin. Her partner, Manfred Grasshoff, shared an apartment with her, and the couple used this as a distribution point for the often banned anarchist newspaper Agit 883. This was printed from Ulandstraße 52 in Berlin-Wilmersdorf and brought to Petra Schelm's flat to be shipped out to other anarchists. In June 1970, the RAF published a manifesto and announced its formation in this paper, so it can be said that Petra Schelm was crucial to the formation of the RAF. The founding members were Petra Schelm, her partner Grasshoff, Horst Mahler, Monika Berberich, and Hans-Jürgen Bacher. That same month, the core group traveled to Jordan with forged identity papers and trained in urban guerrilla tactics with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP. They would soon be joined by Andreas Bader and his partner Gudrun Ensslin. Also joining them in Jordan was Ulrich Meinhof, a radical journalist and well-known commentator who'd become a sort of ideological head of the organization and abandoned her relatively easy life for that of an insurgent. The lives of Bader and Meinhof quickly overshadowed the rest of the group. Bader's violent gangsterism and Meinhof's intellectualism made for a compelling story. This also drove a wedge between Ensslin and Meinhof, with the former accusing the latter of being a terrible revolutionary when it was most likely a conflict rooted in relationship issues. In any case, the nucleus of the first-generation RAF returned to Germany and began a campaign of sabotage and robbery based on the skills they'd gained from the PFLP, sending money back to the Palestinians and getting favors done in return. By this point, police were well aware of Meinhof's involvement and eager to silence her. Her revolutionary writing was convincing, and they worried it could be used to draw young student radicals into the movement. Suddenly, towards the end of 1970, the Jordanian Civil War was fought, and upwards of 10,000 Palestinian civilians who were previously tolerated by the Jordanian government were massacred by them, and both the Red Army faction and the PFLP felt that they had been stabbed in the back. Petra Schelm and other members of the RAF were hotly pursued by German police in connection with the bank robberies and ties to terror groups. Her life took a rapid downward spiral as she found a new relationship with a recovering drug addict named Werner Hopp, living in the political underground. He asked Petra's father for permission to marry her and was obviously given a resounding no. Afterwards, contact with Petra's parents was totally cut off. Police cracked down on Hamburg beginning in mid-July 1971, setting up roadblocks across town. Werner got caught up in a roadblock up this street here, Stressmannstraße. They floored the gas when they had a clear-ish path and were pursued to where they parked the car on Bauernfelder Kirchenweg. Police claim the two fired in their direction and ran together up this road, von Sauerstrasse, towards Reinigstrasse, which is right here on the maps. They ducked behind these apartments and quickly parted ways. Petra Schelm walked through the gardens and left out this very garage exit when she was spotted by patrolling officers. Werner Hopp at this point was long gone, making his way towards the high grass and marshy land next to the highway. They called out, supposedly, for her to surrender, but she raised a pistol and was shot above the left eye. The bullet to the forehead were leaked to the press and caused a surge of new RAF volunteers. This only got worse when papers reported a student claimed he saw the act, and according to this student, police did not identify themselves and instead shot her before she even knew what was happening. Students got to talking and rumors began to swirl. Petra Schelm looked awfully similar to Ulrich Meinhof. This led to speculation that police had shoot-to-kill orders for the leaders of the RAF on behalf of Israel. Her boyfriend, Werner Hopp, was found alongside the road a few hours later, but the murder of Petra was a major propaganda victory for the Red Army faction. Within a year of its founding, they had a martyr, and at least so far as domestically speaking, the RAF hadn't killed anyone. Meanwhile, anarchists and squatters took an interest as these events unfolded. Wolfgang Grams was living in the squats around this time that provided support to M2J, the movement to June. The M2J itself was a symptom of the floundering of anarchist terror at the time that the RAF and allies, prior to 1970, were carrying out highly orchestrated attacks. See, a year prior to the RAF's manifesto, an anarchist group named Tupamaro West Berlin attempted to bomb the main synagogue in the capital. This was to coincide with an event that packed the building, and had the bomb gone off, it could have easily killed 250 people. The group had their warped logic. They claimed that the Jews in Berlin were complicit in the violence against Palestinians in the Middle East. But the bombing of this Jewish religious event was also planned to coincide with the anniversary of the Night of Broken Glass, an early and infamous Nazi pogrom. Even for radical anarchists, this left a horrible taste in people's mouths. Oddly, police seemed to drag their feet in making any arrests. The anarchist movement tore itself apart from the inside in the interim. It was only revealed in the early 2000s that police knew who the leaders were. The man who supplied the bomb was in fact a police informant, and shockingly, the bomb was intended to go off. By some miracle, it didn't detonate, but if the public were to discover that the man who killed hundreds of Jews was on police payroll, West Germany might actually see a real revolution. By 1971, the senior leaders of the Tupamaros were arrested and killed in police shootouts respectively. Anarchists shifted to other groups, forming the M2J and squats around Berlin. Ones who'd been radicalized into Marxism-Leninism drifted towards the Red Army faction, increasingly coalescing around Bader and Ensslin. With the increasing attention came the arrest of Andreas Bader on June 1st, 1972, after a short shootout with police. For the rest of the month, most of the upper leadership of the RAF were arrested. They languished in Stanheim prison, and their case became legendary among leftist students and legal teams. Wolfgang Grams went to meet the imprisoned leaders towards the end of their time in prison. I can't find specific dates, but it probably happened after May 1976, which I believe because multiple sources note his meeting with Bader and Ensslin, but none of them mention a meeting with Ulrich Meinhof, who'd committed suicide on May 9th.
Privatangelegenheiten sind eminent politisch. Kindererziehung ist unheimlich politisch. Die Beziehungen, die Menschen untereinander haben, sind unheimlich politisch, weil sie etwas darüber aussagen, ob Menschen unterdrückt sind oder frei sind, ob sie Gedanken fassen können oder ob sie keine Gedanken fassen können, ob sie das tun können oder nichts tun können. Von den Bedürfnissen der Kinder her gesehen ist die Familie, beziehungsweise, ist der stabile Ort mit stabilen menschlichen Beziehungen notwendig, unerlässlich. Schwer, unheimlich schwer. Na, ist schwer. Ist unheimlich schwer. Das ist natürlich viel einfacher, wenn man ein Mann ist. Und wenn man also eine Frau hat, die sich um die Kinder kümmert und das geht in Ordnung und die Kinder brauchen ja wirklich stabile Verhältnisse und einen, der wirklich viel Zeit für sie hat. Und wenn man eine Frau ist und also keine Frau hat, die das für einen übernimmt, muss man das alles selber machen und das ist unheimlich schwer. Also ist das Problem aller politisch arbeitenden Frauen, mein eigenes inklusive, dieses, dass sie auf der einen Seite gesellschaftlich notwendige Arbeit machen, dass sie einen Kopf voll richtiger Sachen haben, dass sie eventuell auch wirklich reden und schreiben und agitieren können. Aber auf der anderen Seite mit ihren Kindern genauso hilflos da sitzen wie alle anderen Frauen auch. Und sehr viele von diesen Frauen auch dieselben Schwierigkeiten innerhalb ihrer Familien haben, die alle anderen Frauen auch haben. Wenn man so will, ist das die zentrale Unterdrückung der Frau, dass man ihr Privatleben als Privatleben im Gegensatz stellt und einem politischen Leben. Wobei man umgekehrt sagen kann, da wo politische Arbeit nicht was zu tun hat mit dem Privatleben, bestimmt sie nicht, da ist perspektivisch nicht durchzuhalten. Man kann nicht antiautoritäre Politik machen und zu Hause seine Kinder verhauen. Man kann aber auf die Dauer auch nicht zu Hause seine Kinder nicht verhauen, ohne Politik zu machen. Das heißt, man kann nicht innerhalb einer Familie die Konkurrenzverhältnisse aufheben, ohne nicht darum kämpfen zu müssen, die Konkurrenzverhältnisse auch außerhalb der Familie aufzuheben, in die jeder reinkommt, der also seine Familie anfängt zu verlassen.
Wenige Monate später verließ Ulrike Meinhof ihre Kinder.
The surviving members of the RAF claim that Meinhof was murdered by state authorities or forced into suicide through inhuman isolation. This fractured her mind, and in combination with relationship difficulties between herself and Gudrun Ensslin, Bader's partner, she broke down. Even before the suicides that shook leftist politics in late 1977, Wolfgang Grams was spreading the word to his followers in the squats around Germany. The RAF became an issue taken up by Germany's anarchists around this point. Wolfgang told his comrades that the prison was torturing them. On top of this, hunger strikes were spreading, and several RAF members and supporters died agonizing deaths from starvation. Grams then became a minor celebrity because of his ties to the main leaders of the first-generation RAF. On April 7, 1977, Siegfried Buback was killed in an ambush right here, often said to be the first assassination attributed to the Red Army faction, and while their leaders were all in prison. He studied law in Leipzig and joined the Nazi Party, and afterwards was considered an important enough person to be held as a POW in France until 1947. From 1953 until his death, he worked for the state prosecutor's office, specializing in prosecuting left-wing students. Buback had a home in Neurut, and on the day he was killed was making his way to the courthouse in Karlsruhe with a bodyguard. While waiting at this traffic light, a motorcycle drove up alongside his car. A driver in the front, a gunman armed with an HK-43 in the back. 15 shots killed Siegfried Buback. His driver and an officer of the court were also killed in the attack. The RAF claimed responsibility and said they were in a state of war and that the act was therefore justified. Whatever can be said about the excesses of the RAF, it deserves reiterating that the group didn't embark on domestic assassinations until their leadership were all behind bars.
Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Generalbundesanwalt Buback ist heute ermordet worden. Bei dem Anschlag in Karlsruhe wurde auch sein Fahrer getötet. Ein Sicherheitsbeamter liegt mit schweren Verletzungen im Krankenhaus.
Die Schüsse fielen heute Morgen um 9:15 Uhr auf dieser Kreuzung. Der Fahrer, tödlich getroffen, stürzte aus dem Dienstwagen auf die Straße. Das führerlose Auto rollte noch etwa 10 Meter weiter. Hier zogen Passanten Generalbundesanwalt Buback aus dem Wagen. Er war ebenfalls tot. Das Fahrzeug war von 13 Schüssen getroffen worden.
As with most things RAF, it took decades before more details were made known about this killing. Oddly enough, Siegfried's son was contacted by a jilted former RAF volunteer named Peter Jürgen Hoof. He's been behind several recent revelations concerning this period of left-wing terror. It's a little difficult as an English speaker to piece together Jürgen's motives in this, but he's told the press that he got the impression that the first generation of the RAF were as extreme as the Nazis, and it may be that he had an anti-authoritarian streak that was true in many RAF volunteers. These ideological differences caused him to distance himself from the group over time.
Obere Kommandoebene ist nicht richtig. Ich sage, es gab verschiedene Kommandos. Und natürlich war es möglich, zum Beispiel am Vorgehen eines anderen Kommandos etwas zu kritisieren. Die Frage war nur, wie weit man sich exponiert dabei. Und da konnte man doch bei verschiedenen Leuten eine gewisse Scheu verzeichnen, es nicht zu tun. Schluss war es wirklich so habe ich es erlebt, dass es im Grunde genommen keine ernsthafte interne Kritik mehr gab. Es gab überhaupt eine langsam verfallende Gesprächskultur. Also wenn ich das mit der ersten Zeit in Aden vergleiche, dann war es zum Schluss eigentlich mehr die Sprachlosigkeit, die da Einzug gehalten hat.
Furthermore, Peter Jürgen Hoof could be seen as one of the more elite members of the group. While Petra Schelm had the look of a martyr and the interplay between Bader and Meinhof made for a good story, that early trip to Jordan was rightly shown in the movie as a bit of pie-in-the-sky wishful thinking, a bunch of young revolutionaries reading Mao and talking about armed struggle being the highest form of Marxism-Leninism. Jürgen, meanwhile, had specifically trained in multiple countries, including in South Yemen, where he had acquired hijacking skills. He was an elite leftist insurgent if ever there was one, and the increasingly aimless violence of the RAF, especially after they were left leaderless, drove him away for good. Anyway, Jürgen claims that Stefan Wisniewski fired the fatal shots. Another volunteer named Veronica Becker issued similar statements. Wisniewski, now a free man, shared a common past with many factionists. He was born in the Black Forest in 1953 to a widowed mother of three, a refugee fleeing East Prussia after World War I. His father, a Polish man, was used by the Nazis in the slave labor battalions. His dad died before Stefan was 1 year old, and he never got the opportunity to ask him why he didn't return to Poland, which at the time was communist. His mom warned Wisniewski not to talk about his upbringing, explaining to him that a number of SS officers lived in their village. She feared reprisals on the both of them, on her son because he was naturally rebellious, and on herself because she had married a Polish laborer. She also had several other children, and a life in rural West Germany in the 1950s was especially difficult for a single mother in her position. Ever the rebel, 15-year-old Stefan Wisniewski was sent to a reform school after he ran away from his position as an electrician's apprentice. These reform schools used forced labor, and you can imagine how this enraged Stefan, whose father suffered a similar fate. In 1 year alone, he attempted to escape 7 times and came to the conclusion that the poor would always be kept in shackles by the state. In his brief moments of freedom, he became acquainted with the writings of Meinhof and Ensslin, both of whom opposed similar reform schools. When he was released, he moved to Hamburg and worked in the shipyards. He lived in squats associated with radicals and joined the riots at the conservative Springer Press. When Holger Mines died in a 1974 hunger strike, he was motivated enough to actually join and participated in the West German embassy siege in Stockholm in the following year. By the summer of 1976, he found himself training with the PFLP in South Yemen with the man that would later implicate him in the killing of Siegfried Buback, Peter Jürgen Buch. He was a natural choice for the final kidnapping attempt to secure the release of the RAF leadership in 1977. In August, a bank was robbed in Essen to gather funds to finance the kidnapping of a business mogul and former SS officer, Hans Martin Schleyer. This was on orders from Stefan Wisniewski, who'd earned the nom de guerre, the Fury, or Der Fury. He orchestrated the kidnapping and drove the getaway van in this act. The month before, a gun store was robbed in Frankfurt. It was for the same reason, to kidnap Schleyer. The main volunteer to mention here has a different backstory entirely. Like Ulrich Meinhof, he was more of an ideologue. He's buried in the outskirts of Stuttgart. His name was Willi Peter Stoll. According to his family, he was a sensitive and quiet boy in school, often bullied, and he kept to himself. When he graduated, he took a quiet job as a tax assistant. Like many other radicals, he was born in 1950 and appalled at the fact that his father's generation hadn't seemingly reconciled with their past. His first real act of defiance came when he received conscription orders. He dutifully ignored them and was arrested. When taken to the barracks, he proudly told the officers he'd never fight in their imperialist wars, so they declared him a conscientious objector. Here, we start to see similar patterns between Stoll and Wolfgang Grams. Both seem to be more about opposing authoritarianism than fighting for Marxism-Leninism. Ostracized from his job, Willi Stoll moved with his wife and child to a large building at the base of Killesberg Hill that was taken over by an anarchist squat group. An educated young man, he joined Red Aid and offered legal advice to arrested anarchists and urban fighters. He was one of the legal advisors to the RAF's first generation when they were locked up in Stanheim, and likely met Wolfgang Grams while he was there. After Ulrich Meinhof's suicide in prison, Stoll finally decided on a path of direct action. He joined in the gun shop raid in Frankfurt and teamed up with the group led by Stefan Wisniewski, who had garnered respect for his role in the Stockholm embassy siege. Now that he'd gotten his hands dirty in Frankfurt, he was tied to the group to the very end. And on the 5th of September, 1977, their planning came together. Now that most of the ideologues and fighters with real training were locked up, the RAF was shifting into its second generation, led mostly by members of the Patients Collective, which aimed to weaponize mental illness against capitalism. Prior to the massacre and kidnapping of Hans Martin Schleyer, Stefan Wisniewski christened the new terror cell the Siegfried Hausner Commando after his friend who was mortally wounded in the siege of 1975. Back in 75, they were aiming for a release of dozens of arrested RAF members, and 2 volunteers sat near the explosive detonators inside the embassy, Hausner and Karl-Heinz Delwo. According to Delwo, only the 2 of them could have triggered the detonators, and while they were issuing commands to the authorities, one of the detonators inexplicably went off near Hausner. His skull was fractured and his body covered in burns, but rather than sending him to a local hospital, he was sent to Stanheim prison, where even the local doctors remarked they didn't have the equipment needed to keep him alive. He lingered for several days before he passed away, and Stefan Wisniewski called it a murder. Most on the far left agreed with him. And so it was left up to the Siegfried Hausner Commando to kidnap Hans Martin Schleyer, a former SS officer and the president of the Employers Association. The left had hated him. Since 1968, he was defiantly anti-student protest and lobbied against them while refusing to denounce his past as an ideological Nazi. Hausner Commando knew he traveled in an armed convoy because of the reputation he'd built for himself. Stefan the Fury Wisniewski gave orders from a follow-up van as members of the cell sprang an ambush right here in Cologne. Peter Jürgen Buch, who'd trained with Wisniewski in South Lemon, and Sieglinde Hoffmann pushed a baby carriage into the street in front of Schleyer's car. Their goal was to make it look like they were friends meeting and accidentally bumping it. Schleyer's car braked before the follow-up vehicle could respond, and they were rear-ended. In that time, the Hausner Commando sprang from the van and executed the 3 armed guards and driver, and then drove off with Schleyer before backup could arrive. Willi Stoll was there with them, probably regretting it as the reality of the situation sunk in. Hans Martin Schleyer was kept as a prisoner in a soundproofed cell, moved occasionally from one apartment to another. The flag of Siegfried Hausner Commando was tacked on the wall behind him as the RAF made him read out their demands.
Gelegenheit, meiner Familie, allen Freunden und Kollegen für die Unterstützung zu danken, insbesondere auch den 4 Herren, die am Dienstag dem Bundeskanzler ihre große Besorgnis vorgetragen haben. Ich frage mich in meiner jetzigen Situation, muss denn wirklich noch etwas geschehen, um in Bonn eine Entscheidung zu ermöglichen? Letztlich sitze ich ja hier in Partisanen-Terroristenhaft seit über 5 Wochen, weil ich mich für diesen Staat und seine freiheitlich-demokratische Ordnung in der Öffentlichkeit jahrelang eingesetzt und exponiert habe. Manches, was in den letzten Tagen auch von politischer Seite geäußert wurde, muss ich geradezu als eine Verhöhnung dieser Tätigkeit empfinden.
The plans of the terrorists were made worthless on October 18, 1977, when the leadership of the RAF all committed suicide on the same day while isolated in Stanheim prison. Gudrun Ensslin, like Ulrich Meinhof, was found hanging in her cell. Jean-Karl Rasp and Andreas Bader both shot themselves. When leftists began questioning how two of the most monitored men in the world could have smuggled guns in, it was revealed that Bader was shot in the back of the head. Legal advisors like Willi Stoll, if he weren't actively in hiding, began demanding autopsies and toxicology reports, but prison authorities publicly stated they lost their brains. Doctors from the nearby university wanted to find a physiological cause for terrorism, so they removed their brains but had since misplaced them. Hans Schleyer was driven into the woods and executed in retaliation. Willi Stoll was distraught and forced to live underground, while his probable acquaintance, Wolfgang Grams, was increasingly self-radicalized. Most leftists think that the RAF-3 were assassinated by prison authorities because the government knew that the leadership of the RAF was now mostly firmly in the hands of the Patients Collective. 3 days before the supposed suicide pact, Hausner Kommando released proof of life for Hans Schleyer, but the main issue for the West German government would have obviously been with the hijackings. Remember, Buch had trained in hijacking and the RAF had been affiliated with the PFLP for years. Furthermore, the PFLP acted as left-wing mercenaries. They would commit acts on behalf of European groups, and Europeans, or others, for example the Japanese, would aid them in their fight. Even in 1972, Japanese communists killed 26 people on the PFLP's behalf during the Lod airport massacre, and now that there were prisoners in Stanheim who needed released, the PFLP was happy to return a favor to their old comrades in the RAF. 4 Palestinian volunteers hijacked a flight and diverted a course to Somalia. They demanded the release of the RAF's leadership and several Palestinians held by Turkey. The hijackers were stunned by the news of the triple suicide. Soon after, elite German GSG-9 counterterrorism officers stormed the cockpit and killed 3 of the 4 hostage-takers. The immediate conjecture was that the government killed the 3 in prison to prevent the remnants of the RAF from realizing a full alliance with the PFLP and continuing with international terrorism like the hijacking in Somalia. Now came a full crackdown. Most of the RAF were arrested or died in shootouts. Willi Peter Stoll made it a long time, but seemed checked out and fine with going, doubtless stunned by their actions during the Schleyer ambush. By late 78, he was living anonymously in northern Germany and had told his friends that he wanted to be buried next to the trio when the police inevitably killed him. That day came on September 6th, right here.
Die konspirative Wohnung in Düsseldorf, die nach dem gewaltsamen Tod des mutmaßlichen Terroristen Willi Peter Stoll entdeckt worden ist, sollte offenbar als Ausgangsbasis für geplante politische Gewalttaten dienen. Nach Mitteilung der Polizei befand sich in den Räumen ein regelrechtes Waffenlager. In dem Apartment waren außerdem medizinisches Gerät, Verbandsmaterial und Blutplasma gelagert. Die Spurensicherung ergab, dass sich in der Wohnung außer Stoll, Angelika Speitel und Silke Meyer-Witt auch Adelheid Schulz aufgehalten hat. Zudem hätten sich Querverbindungen zu Rudolf Heißler und Inge Fied ergeben, die ebenfalls wegen terroristischer Gewalttaten gesucht werden.
Lautsprecher durchsagen und 20.000 Flugblätter sollen bei der Fahndung nach Terroristen helfen. Die Düsseldorfer Polizei sucht besonders die mutmaßlichen Terroristinnen Angelika Speitel und Silke Meyer-Witt. Ihre Fingerabdrücke fand man in der Wohnung des am Mittwoch erschossenen Willi Peter Stoll. In Düsseldorf und Umgebung überprüften etwa 800 Beamte mehr als 1000 Wohnungen. Weitere konspirative Unterkünfte wurden aber nicht gefunden.
At the time, this was the Shanghai restaurant. Someone recognized him and alerted the police, who claimed that he pulled a gun. Stoll was shot 4 times and pronounced dead at the hospital. Unfortunately for his family, who wanted him buried quietly and without fanfare at a more local cemetery, one of the staff leaked this info to the press, who were peering over the walls to get a better view of the procession. Wolfgang Grams was keeping his head down. He was an anarchist, a squatter, someone frequently heard telling others that the RAF had been murdered in prison, but in 1980, his name was found in the pocketbook of a militant who'd been killed in a shootout. Based on this, police detained him for 153 days, grilling him with endless interrogations before finally letting him go as if nothing had happened. This was probably the last straw. By 1984, he was dating Birgit Hogefield, who looked up to him as a revolutionary. Birgit Hogefield was close friends with Eva Hall, leader of the third-generation RAF. As already mentioned, both women felt that Wolfgang Grams was a main factor in legitimizing the movement. With the recent invasion of Grenada and the toppling of the Afro-Caribbean socialist movement there, the ongoing conflict in Nicaragua at the time, the El Salvadorian Civil War, and the multinational force in Lebanon, the third generation of the RAF felt that the iron was hot enough to strike in the early to mid-1980s. While the Soviet Union waned, Third Worldist movements continued stronger than ever, and greater public attention was being given to post-colonial movements, particularly in Africa and South America. With Willy Peter Stoll dead, and most other RAF leaders in prison, the trio, Eva, Birgit, and Wolfgang, continued planning up to the murder of Ed Pimentel in 1985. Eva Hall was arrested months after the killing, charged with murder and conspiracy. She was released in 2011, the last of the RAF prisoners to be freed. To this day, she expresses no remorse. Wolfgang Grams and Birgit Hogefield continued their two-person insurgency from the German anarchist underground and became legendary figures in those circles. From the time they went on the run until their capture, the Berlin Wall came down, November 1989, and in October 1990, East Germany formally ceased to exist. In these left-wing circles, a new figure became public enemy number one, Detlev Rohwedder. A social democrat, he had a special place in the vision of German communists because of that party's history. In his seminal history work, Black Jacobins, describing the indecisiveness of some officers of the San Domingo Revolution, C.L.R. James says, quote, "So your liberal and social democrat hesitates and dithers until the sledgehammer of fascism falls on his head, or Franco launches his carefully prepared counter-revolution." Without getting lost in the weeds, after World War I in Germany, institutional power lay with the Social Democrats. Ever the good liberals, they did the same that American liberals do, focus on tearing down the left rather than instituting reforms or fighting the far right. This was seen as especially egregious in Germany because the SPD mobilized the fascist Freikorps to put down worker uprisings that seized the factory towns along the Ruhr. Under the gun, these striking workers and council Republicans were forced to return to work for reduced pay. When the Nazis rose to power, the SDP dutifully followed the law and immediately disbanded after Hitler's Enabling Act of 1933. For the most part, they fiddled their thumbs for the remainder of the war and returned in 1945 to pick up the pieces. East Germany recognized these liberal shortcomings and quickly merged the Social Democrat Party with the Communist Party, creating the Socialist Unity Party, or SED. Thereafter, many believed that the West German Social Democrats became increasingly conservative. This was Rohwedder's party. His reputation was that of a carpetbagger in the Reconstruction-era South. Because more than just a social democrat, he was the president of the trust agency responsible for privatizing business and institutions owned by the East German government. He was also the CEO of a large steel conglomerate and the Minister of Economics from 1969 to 1978, during the height of the RAF. His offices, the office of the trust agency Treuhand, were in this complex, the former headquarters of the Ministry of Aviation in central Berlin. The RAF had their sights on him, but oddly committed a separate attack less than 2 months before his killing. Somehow, members of the Red Army faction obtained a G1 rifle and used it to attack the U.S. Embassy in Bonn. From a distance of 500 meters across the Rhine, they fired 250 rounds at the embassy's broad side, causing minor damage and blown-out windows, but no serious injuries. The shooter or shooters used a stolen VW Passat as a getaway vehicle, and in 2001, the hair was tested, revealing one possible suspect, Daniela Klett. She was only apprehended in 2024 and is facing trial now. The note left at the scene claimed the act for the RAF and demanded an end to the U.S.'s involvement in the imperialist Gulf War. The same G3 rifle was used to kill Rohwedder on April 1st, 1991. Half an hour before midnight, the assassin, presumably Wolfgang Grams, positioned himself with a clear view to the window and fired 3 shots into his home at Kaiser Friedrich Ring 71 on the main street next to a beautiful part of the city that skirts the river. One shot killed Detlev Rohwedder, the other wounded his wife, and a third struck the bookshelf. The killer left a note stating that the act had been carried out by the RAF's Ulrich Wessel Commando. The naming of the cell makes sense in context. The Siegfried Hausner Commando, involved in the kidnapping and murder of Hans Martin Schleyer, was named for one of the men who died in the Stockholm siege after the detonator malfunctioned. This premature explosion caused Ulrich Wessel to drop his grenade, which likewise exploded and killed him on the spot. In 2001, authorities determined that the hair found at the scene matched Wolfgang Grams. By that time, however, he'd been dead for years. Here's how that happened. June 22, 1993. Wolfgang Grams and Birgit Hogefield had been living for years on the run, hiding in safe houses, keeping a low profile. They were most wanted for the murder of Pimental, but obviously needed for questioning over incidents like the Bonn embassy shooting and the death of Rohwedder. On that day, they were set to arrive at the train station in Bad Kleinen. However, someone tipped off the police.
Wir sind dann direkt losgestürmt unter Rufen wie Halt, Polizei, stehen bleiben.
Und jetzt kam die brüllende Meute. Grams rast hoch, zieht seine Waffe.
Und ich sah oben einen Mann stehen in unsere Richtung und ich sah eine Schusswaffe. Ich habe das körperlich gespürt, dass auf uns geschossen wird. Das waren wirklich Druckwellen dort, die da auf mich zukamen.
Auf einmal höre ich die Schießerei. Und dann ging das so dumm, dumm und dann dumm, 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 also unheimlich viele Schüsse. Ich dann gleich Bahnsteig 3-4 hingelaufen, da waren die Reisenden, die schrien.
GSG-9 responded, knowing this would be a dangerous move. Wolfgang was always armed and wouldn't hesitate to draw his gun. Counter-terror officers weighed their options. Wait for a better time and scoop them up separately, or risk losing one of them and jump on this perfect opportunity to take them both and accept an added pressure of a little bit more danger. They chose the latter.
Der Gedrohte wird ohne Gegenwehr festgenommen.
Dann kam mir jemand entgegen, wir brauchen Sanikasten, wir brauchen Sanikasten. Dann zurückgelaufen zu mir rein, dann habe ich unten den Sanikasten rausgeholt. Dann hat mir schon einer den Sanikasten aus der Hand gerissen und ist damit nach vorne gelaufen. Schrie einer wieder, eine Trage, eine Trage. Die haben wir aber nicht gefunden. Dann hat man von dem Gepäckwagen die Seitenwände rausgerissen und hat diese, weil die sehr lang waren wie eine Trage, und hat die dann mitgenommen.
Auf dem Bahnsteig liegt der 26-jährige Michael Nefzeller mit schweren Schussverletzungen.
Als wir dann auch auf dem Bahnsteig angekommen sind und ich diese Situation da so überblicken konnte, habe ich gesagt, so nach dem Motto, was ist denn hier eigentlich los? Und da sagte einer, gut gegen böse. Ob gut oder böse spielt überhaupt gar keine Rolle in der Versorgung des Patienten. Der war so schwer verletzt, dass man sich um diesen hat sofort kümmern müssen. Wir haben einen intravenösen Zugang gelegt, eine Infusion gelegt. Der Patient wurde ordentlich verbunden. Er wurde anschließend intubiert, beatmet und zu unserem Hubschrauber verbracht.
Michael Nefzeller, genannt Shorty, erliegt Stunden später seinen schweren Verletzungen. Wolfgang Grams hat einen Kopfschuss erlitten. Er wird in die Uniklinik Lübeck geflogen, wo auch er später verstirbt. 2 Tote bei einem Einsatz der GSG 9, darunter einer der eigenen Leute.
The couple were intercepted on track number 4. GSG-9 claims that they called out to them, telling them to stop and drop their weapon. Grams pulls his gun, is wounded, but managed to kill one of the officers. Visibly distraught, he raised the gun and shot himself in the head, at which point police cuffed his girlfriend, Birgit Hogefield. Family and friends reject the claim of suicide. German radicals say that he was wounded in a shootout with police, and when the officers realized he'd killed one of their own, they executed him outright. This case made it to court, but all of the involved police were found not guilty in 1999.